The opening that I'm going to show you today is a very aggressive system played by legends like Bobby Fischer, Garry Kasparov and Magnus Carlsen. And the best part, you can play it no matter whatever white does. Your setup remains the same. It's the King's Indian defense, a dynamic and powerful opening that lets black invite white to take the center, but only to strike back with a crushing attack. In this video, I'm going to show you how to play the King's Indian defense from beginners to advanced. So let's begin. So, d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4 and d6. This is the ideal setup we are going for, also known as the King's Indian defense. It doesn't matter whatever white does. White can play 1d4, white can play c4, white can play e4. Your setup still remains the same. The only thing you need to remember here is whenever white does play e4, you need to play the move d6 in order to stop white e5 to attack the knight. That's it. And after d6, black is having mainly three options to continue the game. White can develop the knight, white can push the pawn to f4 or f3, which is also known as the Semish variation, one of my favorite systems to play against the King's Indian. First, starting with the most logical move and the most played move, which is knight to f3. Following the basic fundamental developing the knight, we castle up. White develops the bishop, and after bishop e2, black strikes the center with e5. Black is majorly having two pawn breaks available in the King's Indian defense, you must remember, e5 and the c5 break. I'm going to recommend you to go for the move e5 in this particular position. After e5, white is having majorly three options to continue the position. White can take the pawn, push the pawn or just castle up. Makes sense. Starting with the most obvious, capturing the pawn. Black captures it back, white trades off the queen and says, okay, let me capture the pawn on e5. I'm just a pawn up. Temporary basis, as now the bishop is opened up on g7, we can simply grab the pawn on e4, and after takes, we can simply capture the knight on e5 back. Material wise, we have an even position, but I would love to play with the black pieces. My bishop is nicely activated. White's bishop can't move because the b2 pawn would be hanging. I'm having the rook on an open file. My king is already castled up. Opponent's king is still in the center. That's why I would love to play with the black pieces, and I can say black is already slightly better. Going back, taking the pawn is not the best way. Let's say white castles up. After castle up, we are first going to develop the knight to c6, simply following the basic fundamental, developing the minor pieces. Once again, white is having three options. White can push the pawn, take the pawn or just develop the bishop. Starting with what if white simply takes the pawn. We can simply recapture the pawn back, and we are once again having a very fine position. We can just finish our development with bishop g4, maybe take the knight on f3, put our c6 knight on d4, and we are already pretty happy. Going back, if white goes for developing the bishop on e3. After bishop e3, we are finally going to develop the rook, and with rook e8, we are threatening something. We want to take the pawn on d4, and once white recaptures it back, we want to capture the pawn on e4. After knight e4, we can simply recapture the knight with the rook. So after rook e8, white have to push the pawn to d5. But now here's come one idea that you must remember whenever you are playing the King's Indian defense. You can centralize your knight on d4. And now what's the idea? I want to capture the bishop on e2. Once white recaptures it, I can finish my development by putting my bishop on g4, and I am pretty happy. I can move my knight from the f6 square and launch a kingside expansion with f5, and I would love to play with the black pieces. So white is like, let me take the knight on d4. Pawn takes and bishop takes. White is a pawn up. But now, black is going to recapture the pawn on e4 with the knight. White captures the bishop, king captures it back, and if knight captures the knight, we can simply recapture the knight with the rook. It's a fine position. White can give a check with the queen. It's a double attack on the knight and also a check. We can simply develop the queen. No need to worry. White is forced to take the queen, and we can simply recapture the queen with the knight or with the king. I would personally recommend you to simply capture it with the king. Why? We are in the end game, the queens have been traded off. It's a quote that you must remember. In the end game, you must activate your king. Our king is much activated, much closer to the center compared to the white's king. That's why I can say we are already much better in this position. Just double up the rooks, develop the bishop to d7, and black is pretty good to go. Going back, that's exactly what happens if bishop e3. If white goes for pushing up the pawn on d5, makes sense. Attacking the knight, we simply go back with the knight. And after knight e7, white goes with his usual idea of playing the move b4. Now, if you are seeing this opening for the first time, you are already shocked. Why b4? But if you already know how to play the King's Indian, I'm pretty much sure that you know b4 is the main move in this position. What's the idea? So basically, whenever you are in the middle game and you have no plan, you have no idea on which side of the board you must play. There are three sides: king side, center, and the queen side. You can easily judge it on which side you need to play by looking at the pawn structure. By looking at the pawn structure, I can already say that the pawn structure aims at the king side, so I need to play on the king side by moving my knight on h5 or e8 and strike with f5, playing on the king side. Whereas white's pawn is aiming at the queen side. So white is trying to push his pawns on the queen side and try to get the c5 break in. So what black is going to do is try to stop it and try to generate his own counterplay on the king side. So here black strikes with a5. But the main question here is, what's the big idea of white expanding on the queen side? So basically, if I give free move to white in the position, for example, if I just move the king here and there, white would love to push the pawn to c5, take the pawn on d6, just get the knight to c4 to attack this pawn, push the pawn to b5, push the pawn to a4, and get the bishop to a3, attack the pawn on d6. And you see, I'm just being a pawn down then. I'm going to lose my weakness. So that's why, going back, after b4, black plays, we are going to play the move a5. Attacking the pawn on b4, white can't push a3 because after takes, the rook is hanging. So, for example, if white pushes, we can play b6, white is never going to achieve c5, and now we are going to have a free play on the king side. We are already better. The best move for white is to take the pawn. We capture with the rook, bishop e3, trying to get the c5 in somehow, though it's still not coming up. We can play the move knight to h5, going with our idea of f5. White develops the queen, we strike with f5. We are threatening to play the move f4, trapping the bishop. White have to take, and now it's a question. We can take with the knight, we can take with the bishop, we can take with the rook, and we can take with the pawn. But my favorite response, and practically human wise, we should always take with the pawn. Why? Because now we are having two pawn pushes that are very strong in the position. f4 traps the bishop, e4 opens up the dark square bishop. And now, after taking with the g-pawn, another idea to attack the opponent's king is to get the king to h8, get the rook to g8, push f4, open up the light square bishop, and try to launch a deadly attack on the opponent's king. Looks very interesting. And now, after gf5, all those who solve tactics on a daily basis must be thinking, okay, knight e5 just attacks the knight. What's the big problem? If black recaptures it back, white would just be a pawn up. That's so true. But in this position, I can just play f4, which is a very strong move in the position. Why? Because I'm attacking two pieces now. If you move the bishop, I'll just capture it back. The bishop is hanging. And now if you take it, I'll just take it. And just count the material, black is just a piece up with a completely winning position. So going back, that's exactly what happens if white castles. Going back, if white tries to play the move d5, instead of castling up. Now after d5, we are going to play the move a5. We are having this opportunity of stopping white's b4, so we are going to stop it by playing the move a5. Now b4 is no longer possible, white castles up, and now we first develop the knight to a6. Now there are many ideas behind knight to a6. First, the b4 square is already covered up by the pawn on a5, so we are going to put our a6 knight on c5, attacking the pawn on e4, which is a very juicy pawn. White is like, okay, now white is having two options to continue the position. First, starting with bishop g5. Another option is h3. First, starting with bishop g5, we are simply going to push the pawn on h6, attacking the bishop. if bishop takes the knight, we simply take the bishop. And now you ask me, what's the idea of black? How should black continue the position? I would love to play with knight to c5, putting the knight on a nice square, developing the bishop to d7, going back with the queen to e7, and simply striking with f5. f5 is the idea we are always looking forward whenever we are playing the king's Indian defense. Going back, if the bishop simply drops back to h4, we can play g5, bishop g3, and now you can easily realize the bishop on g3 is simply a bad piece, as all the pawns are already on the dark square, limiting the bishop on g3. Now we are going to play knight h5. The threat of putting the knight on the best square available on f4. And now it looks like maybe there are some tactics possible, but there aren't, because whenever white takes the pawn, we can first take the bishop and just take the knight and we are piece up. So going back, and after h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop goes back, knight h5. For example, if I need to make some free move for black in this position, we would love to put the knight on f4, get the queen to f6, get the queen to g6, get the knight to c5, and get the f5 break. This is the dream position, the dream plan we are aiming for. So that's exactly how you should play whenever your opponent plays bishop to g5. Now, h3. What's the idea of h3? So basically the h3 idea is to take away the g4 square from the knight. And now the idea is to simply put the bishop on e3. We are fine, knight to c5, attacking the pawn on e4. White needs to protect it with queen to c2, defending the pawn 2 times. And now just knight e8. Now knight h5 is also possible, but knight e8 is a bit safer option to be considered, with the threat of the same f5. Whenever you play the king's Indian, you must remember the idea f5. Bishop e3. We don't really care even if the knight is taken by the bishop. We will go with the idea of f5. And after some trade, like, our idea is pretty simple. We would love to push the pawn to f4. Though it's not an obvious answer, we can also take the pawn on e4 if it's optional, if there is some idea behind it by putting the bishop on f5. But I would love to play f4, h6, g5, and basically expand on the king's side, launch a deadly attack to the white king. White can trade. We are simply going to recapture it back with the pawn, bishop c5, dc5, and now you see I'm going to get my a rook into the game with rook a6, rook g6, launching an attack on the king side, king h8, getting another rook to g8, pushing f4, opening up the light square bishop. That's exactly the idea I'm aiming for in this position. Now going back, that's exactly what happens if opponent plays knight to f3. Another idea is to play the move f4, also known as the 4 pawns attack, as opponent is having 4 pawns in the center. Now e5 definitely looks a bit dangerous. We are once again going to castle up simply. Now the main move is to continue with knight to f3. But let's take a deep look at e5, attacking the knight. We capture the pawn over here. White is having 2 options to capture with the d or the f pawn. If white captures with the d pawn, we will first trade off the queen and simply get the knight to d7. And now our idea here is, first of all, the bishop on g7 is a bit blocked thanks to the pawn on e5. So we are going to open up the position with f6 on the next move, and that's exactly what black does. White have to take it back, and after ef6, I would love to play with black. Why? My king is already castled up, the bishop is on a nice square, aiming at the rook. The rook can come into the game with a check, the knight goes to c5, we can happily develop all the pieces, and I would love to play with black. So that's how you are going to play if your opponent takes with de5. If your opponent takes fe5, you once again go back and knight f3. And now you see once again the pawn on e5 is a bit irritating, blocking the knight and the bishop. But I can't really take the pawn thanks to the pawn on d4. So the main problem is the d4 pawn. I need to somehow remove the d4 pawn. So I'm going to strike with c5, attacking the pawn. If white doesn't do anything, I'll simply take it back, develop my knight c6, and simply capture the pawn on e5 for free. White have to take it back, and now instead of capturing the c pawn, we will go for capturing the e pawn. And after a queen trade, we have a trade. The material wise, it's an even position. But black is going to be a pawn up after a couple of moves like knight a6 and simply capturing the pawn on c5 by developing the light square bishop, getting the a rook to c8, and simply capture the pawn on c5. That's it. We are going to be a pawn up. That's exactly how e5 would be a big blunder from the white side. Let's say knight f3, the main move. And now, as I said at the start of the video, e5 and c5 are the two breaks black is always having. We are going to play c5 this time. Capturing the pawn, black is extremely happy. White can take the trade of the queen, play this, and once again we are having the f6 idea up our sleeves. White can go for pushing up the pawn. But now, e6. Why e6? The opponent's king is still in the center, whereas our king is already very safe. You can also develop the light square bishop to finish off your development, but I would personally love to suggest e6. Now, for example, white tries to go e5. Practically speaking up, if you are a beginner, definitely you will get scared of this. But no need to get scared, you can take it and just attack the pawn on e5 with knight g4. It's a double attack. White can try to defend it, the only way is bishop f4, but now just take the pawn in the center and knight d7. You are going to lose a pawn no matter what, and black is just a pawn up. Going back, e5 is not going to work. White can try to capture the pawn on e6, but this time we will simply recapture the pawn back with the pawn. The f file is opened up, the d5 square is covered by the pawn, and now the question is, what's the idea of black? I would love to play knight c6, developing my knight, developing my c8 bishop on b7 on an open diagonal, and that's it. I would love to play with black, queen e7, rook d8, and maybe get the d5 break available in the position. Who knows, maybe putting the knight on d4, getting the knight on h5, attacking the f4 pawn, and black is having many ideas up his sleeve. Going back, that's exactly how you are going to play if your opponent plays the 4 pawn attacks. Now, if opponent plays my favorite, f3, also known as the Semish variation, one of the best variation I would personally recommend you to play with the white pieces. What's the idea? We castle up and white plays bishop e3. The idea of white is to play queen d2, castle long, and launch a kingside attack with g4, h4, h5, which looks very dangerous for black. And after bishop e3, you can play the move c5. That's it. Easy way to equalize the position. White can take the pawn, which is a best way to continue the position. You would be a pawn up, or just play d5. First, talking about d5, we can play the move e6, once again striking in the center. Now, for example, if white just develops the queen, we can take the pawn in the center, white takes it back and just a6. The idea is pretty simple, we want to expand on the queen side. White tries to stop it, but just rook e8, getting all the pieces. And after rook e8, it's very hard to play with white. For example, if white just castles up long. b5, we can sack a pawn, trade off a minor piece. Definitely black is a pawn down, but queen a5 is coming into the game. Rook eb8, we were going to put the knight to c4, f knight to e5. The bishop is already opened up, black is already crushing this position. Going back, if white takes the pawn on e6, now definitely you can simply recapture it back with the pawn, but taking with the bishop is also fine. You are simply developing your pieces. And now you ask me what's the idea of black? You develop the knight to c6, put the queen on a5, you can move your knight from f6 square to d7 to open up the g7 bishop. And that's exactly how you can play this particular position. Going back, if white goes for capturing the pawn, trading off the queen and capturing the c5 pawn, it looks like white is just a pawn up. That's exactly why white goes for this, and this is the best variation for white. But we can simply develop the knight to c6. White can trade off the rooks, and now the main move you need to remember in this particular variation is knight to d7, attacking the bishop and opening up the dark square bishop. The bishop goes back, and now the key move, we simply take the knight. Now white is having the double pawns, white is a pawn up though, and now knight e5. Opening up the light square bishop, which is going to go on e6 on the next move. We are simply going to capture the c4 pawn. Material wise, white can't really protect the pawn on c4. We are going to be materially equal on the next move. In the next 1 to 2 move, white is having a bad pawn structure, whereas black is having a good pawn structure. The rook is going to go on c8, attacking, putting pressure on the pawns on the c file, and I would already love to play with black. It's an even position, heading towards a draw, but if your endgame skills are good, I guess you can easily convert. Not easily, but you can definitely convert this into a win. And with this, we can successfully say that we have completed the King's Indian defense. Now you guys are having a good idea of how to play the King's Indian defense with the black pieces. I have gave it my all, tried to cover every idea that every one of you watching, if you are going to play the King's Indian defense, you must remember all these ideas. And if you want to pursue this opening at the very highest level in the tournament games, I would highly recommend you to watch the games of top players like Hikaru Nakamura and Bobby Fischer, because Bobby Fischer was the one who made this opening at the very top level and made this opening very famous. So I hope that this video was helpful for you. If it was, make sure to like, share and smash that subscribe button. I'm going to see you soon in the next one. Thank you for watching and bye bye.